The sun was just setting when I pulled my truck up to the old ranch, the land I had worked so hard to keep in the family. It had been years since I last drove down that dirt road, and I expected peace. Maybe even a quiet evening of walking the fences and breathing in that wide open air. What I didn't expect was a stranger standing on my porch, arms crossed, glaring at me like I was trespassing on my own land. Before I could even set down my bags, she marched over and announced herself as the head of the neighborhood HOA. I couldn't help but laugh. This was ranch country, miles from the suburbs. And yet, here was a self-declared HOA Karen telling me how things were going to be. At first, I thought it was just a misunderstanding, maybe someone confused about property lines. But the situation escalated quickly when she started listing so-called rules about what I could and couldn't do on my own ranch. The final straw. She actually pulled out her phone and called the cops, saying I was violating HOA regulations by being there, my own home, my own land. What she didn't realize was that I wasn't just some rancher she could push around. In fact, I had been running and managing HOAs across the entire country for years. I knew the laws, the loopholes, and the exact limits of her so-called authority. But instead of revealing my hand right away, I decided to let her dig herself in deeper. And that's when things took a turn no one expected. The officer arrived. Not long after her call, lights flashing against the quiet fields. I stood by my truck, calm as ever, while she waved her arms like she had just uncovered the crime of the century. She pointed at me, declaring that I had illegally entered property that she claimed was now under HOA control. The officer glanced between us, clearly unsure why he'd been called out to what looked like nothing more than a dusty ranch road. I explained who I was, that this land had been mine for years, and that the deed was still in my name. Karen, however, wasn't backing down. She handed over a binder filled with typed-up HOA bylaws, claiming the entire area had been annexed into her association while I was gone. Page after page of rules about paint colors, lawn length, even livestock. It was almost laughable, except for the fact that she looked dead serious. The officer flipped through the papers, eyebrows raised, but something in her confidence made it clear she wasn't just making this up on the spot. She really believed she had authority here. That was the moment I realized this wasn't going to be a quick conversation. There was more going on behind the scenes, and she was determined to make me the first example of her power. I didn't argue further. Instead, I let her talk, let her explain. While quietly holding on to the truth, she didn't know that I wasn't just familiar with HOA law. I practically wrote the playbook. And soon, that knowledge was going to turn everything upside down. The officer eventually asked me to step aside so he could speak with Karen privately. But I could still hear her voice carrying across the yard. She kept insisting that the HOA community had full jurisdiction over my ranch, that I was required to submit plans if I wanted to rebuild the barn, repaint the porch, or even replace the fencing. It was surreal. She was talking about my family's land as if it were a cookie-cutter suburban lot. As I listened, I started to piece things together. While I'd been away, a small group of developers had moved in just a few miles down the road, building a cluster of houses and forming their own HOA. Somehow, Karen had convinced herself that their authority stretched all the way out here. Maybe she wanted to expand control, or maybe she was just power-hungry. But either way, she was acting as though my ranch was the crown jewel of her little empire. The officer looked tired already, caught between her binder of rules and the reality of my deed. That's when a few neighbors showed up, curious about the flashing lights. Some whispered about how Karen had been overstepping lately, trying to ticket people for leaving tools in their own yards or even threatening fines for having chickens. Others, though, seemed nervous like they'd been bullied into compliance before. I realized then that this wasn't just about me. Karen had been tightening her grip on the entire area, and people were too intimidated to fight back. My return to the ranch had lit a spark, and now all eyes were on me. The question was whether I would play along or finally call her bluff. Karen wasn't letting go. She marched right up to the officer with her binder still clutched in her hands, flipping through pages and jabbing her finger at sections as if they were carved in stone. Her voice rose, sharp and commanding, declaring that if the officer didn't remove me from her HOA property, she'd escalate this to the county board. She even threatened to fine me on the spot, rattling off numbers like she was reading from an invoice. The officer held up his hand, trying to calm her down, but the tension was thick. Behind him, the small crowd of neighbors had grown. Some stood, with folded arms, silently rooting for me, while others looked pale, clearly worried about being dragged into her drama. A few whispered about how she'd already tried to impose restrictions on their wells and gardens. The fear in their eyes told me they'd been living under her shadow for too long. I stayed quiet, but inside I was calculating. Every word she spoke revealed more about how far she had stretched her so-called authority. She had crossed lines she didn't even realize existed, and I knew the law inside and out. Still, I let her rant, let her dig in deeper, because the moment wasn't ready yet. Then she did something that changed the tone completely. She pulled out an envelope, waved it in the air, and announced that she had already filed paperwork claiming oversight of my ranch. The crowd gasped, the officer stiffened, and Karen smiled like she'd just won. That was the breaking point. The stage was set, the pressure at its peak, and everyone was waiting to see what would happen when the truth finally came out. The envelope in her hand seemed to give her a new level of confidence. She waved it like a trophy, telling everyone that her HOA board had already voted and approved jurisdiction over the ranch. The neighbors murmured nervously, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others looking like they weren't sure what this meant for them. The officer asked to see the papers, and that's when the second twist hit me. She wasn't bluffing. The documents inside had official stamps from the county office. Somehow, she had managed to push through filings that listed my property as part of her HOA boundaries. For the first time, I felt the weight of the situation shift. This wasn't just Karen's obsession with power. She had connections, or at least someone helping her push the paperwork through. It wasn't a random misunderstanding. It was part of a bigger move to seize control of land far outside the original subdivision. The neighbors reacted fast. One man spoke up, saying his property had suddenly appeared in her maps too, even though he lived nearly 2 miles away. Another admitted she'd been threatened with fines if she didn't cut down a shed her grandfather built decades ago. It became clear this wasn't just me against Karen, this was a pattern, and I had walked straight into the middle of it. Karen's smile widened as she watched the tension rise. She thought she had cornered me, that her papers would force me to back down in front of everyone. But what she didn't know was that she had just exposed the very weakness I was waiting for. The conflict wasn't just local anymore, it was about to become national. The officer studied the stamped papers carefully, and for a moment, the crowd held its breath. Karen stood tall, convinced she had finally trapped me with her so-called legal authority. But that was the moment I stepped forward, calm but firm, and pulled out my own folder from the truck. Inside were federal documents, board listings, and contracts, proof that I wasn't just another homeowner, but the executive director overseeing multiple HOAs across the country. I laid the paperwork on the hood of the cruiser for everyone to see. The officer's eyes widened as he compared the two. Karen's filings might have carried a county stamp, but mine carried the weight of national authority. I explained how HOA boundaries could never cross into private ranch land without consent, and how her filings were not only invalid, but could be considered fraudulent. Gasps rippled through the crowd as I pointed out the loopholes and violations in her own binder. Karen's smile faltered for the first time. The neighbors, once silent, began to cheer and speak out, emboldened by the fact that someone had finally stood up to her. The officer closed her binder, shook his head, and told her she was the one who might be facing consequences now. But just as the tension seemed to break, I revealed one more truth. This wasn't the first county where her name had popped up. Records showed she had tried similar power grabs in other states, always targeting landowners who didn't know the rules. The crowd went silent again. Realizing this was bigger than any of us thought, Karen's plan had crumbled in front of everyone, but her story wasn't finished. What she had started here was only a small part of something much larger, and I knew I hadn't seen the last of her. The officer handed me back my documents, giving me a respectful nod before turning to Karen. For once, she didn't have anything to say. The binder she had been clutching so tightly now hung at her side, the weight of her failed power play written all over her face. The neighbors, who had been living under her pressure for so long, finally stepped forward and spoke freely. Some laughed in relief, others shook my hand, and a few even thanked me for proving what they had suspected all along, that her HOA authority was nothing more than intimidation backed by shaky paperwork. I made it clear to everyone gathered that their rights as landowners were stronger than any false claims an overzealous HOA leader might try to enforce. I explained how rules work, where real HOA boundaries stop, and why it's so important to understand property law before signing or agreeing to anything. For the first time in a long while, the community seemed united, no longer fearful of her fines or threats. Karen, red-faced and defeated, stormed off without another word. The officer promised to forward her filings to the county for review, and by the time the lights from the cruiser faded down the road, peace had returned to the ranch. That night, as I stood on the porch of my family's home, I realized the bigger lesson wasn't just about my land. It was about standing firm when someone tries to take what isn't theirs, about knowing the rules so you can't be pushed around. The ranch was safe, the neighbors were free from her grip, and Karen's empire had finally crumbled. In the end, the land remained where it belonged with those who respected it.